Well, after the third day of our conference, we came together, a small group, and I would like you to speak a little bit about Ibadism, different aspects, theologically, more historically maybe. And I start with Ahmed Ghazal. So just simply, what would you spontaneously say about Ibadism?
Because I studied in the modern period, so I like to do it because I find this some kind of contrast between the Ibadi thought in the 20th century and the past thought. The developments that are happening within Ibadi thought are very interesting, and you can only do that if you actually kind of do the historical survey of. So there's so much missing, and it's such a rich field that if you can't catch up. But I think with what we're starting here, we can actually go somewhere with this and developing this into a really big and deep field called Ibadi studies. And our work complement each other. In a way, when you tell me something about, the early centuries, I can at least understand what's going on now and how things are developing and changing and in what context. And from that perspective, we can see how Ibadism is just part of the global changes. It's not an isolated, or the communities are not isolated. They're just part of the global Muslim community and beyond the Muslim community.
Professor Eichmann, how would you see Ibadism within the broader framework of Islamic schools, let's call it?
Well, in a way, although I come from the opposite end than Amal does come, actually my impression would be very much the same. Like we really can. The really fascinating thing is like the relation, this historical development and the kind of how we can observe how things are kind of being modified, but then being reframed and still from our tradition. And of course, this is something we can observe in other Islamic denominations as well. And I think what would be, of course, very, very interesting would be to apply certain methodological frameworks we have developed for other areas of the study of Islamic theological schools and groups to the study of Ibadism. And there I see that there's still a lot of things to be done, just first starting with the very simple fact of making inventories of the manuscripts of the most important theological works. These things are being in progress, of course, trying to make modern scientific editions of the major source writings and also like the other important texts, like according to modern standards in theory of edition, and then of course going to the field of analysis. And I think the conference has shown how important it is to collaborate and to frame these things in a comprehensive context.
Professor Vaness, you were quite a few times at this conference, somehow called, not verbally, the father of modern Ibadi studies. So
this is not true, of course. If we are looking for fathers, then we should think of the French scholars and of Levitsky, of course, the Polish scholar whom
I said modern. Well. I mean, you are now put already in the field of the new school.
I belong to the old shuyukh. I became interested in Ibadism in the early 70s, so 40 years ago. But I was not socialized in the English tradition, but in the French and the Italian tradition. So I traveled to the Maghreb, not to Oman. It was difficult to go to Oman at that time. Oman and the Maghreb was not so much connected with Oman. The historical tradition of the Maghrebi variety of Ibadism was Basra. So they retraced their tradition to Iraq, to Basra. As a matter of fact, Basra is simply an intermezzo in Ibadi history, but the Maghribi sources talk about it, and what I found interesting about the Basran community, in contrast perhaps to Oman, was that they followed a peculiar political model. Levitsky was one of those people who stressed the importance of the Jamaat al-Muslimin in Basra. That means that these merchants who had come from Oman to Basra, because Basra was the decisive port in their connections with the Iraq and the Arab world, these merchants had a specific senate or some other political institution who decided about their politics. Now, of course, they were living in the early Abbasid Empire, and there was the Caliphate. Many of the Kharijites had rejected the Caliphate. The Ibadis did not. They tried, as it seems, a kind of federalist structure. That means there was the Caliph, he was in Baghdad, of course, they were living in Basra, and they had their own institution, and they wanted to live by themselves and to decide about their religious questions and other things in a separate institution. The experiment failed, of course. They left Basra, went back to Oman, but I was fascinated by this specific experiment, and if it had failed, of course it had to fail under the prevailing circumstances, but if it had not failed, we would have got something like these republics in Italy of the time of the Renaissance, and a system which we have now in Germany, this federalist system. Then they went back to Oman, and they got their own system, the Imamate, and so on. This is something else. But as I said, my interest was first concentrated on Basra, and then, of course, on the history of Ibadism in the Maghreb, where the Ibadis were merchants, as they were in Oman, but merchants not on the sea, but on the land trade through the Sahara. And this is another aspect of Ibadism, an aspect which we have not yet touched in our conference, but which is, I think, as important as the sea trade from Oman.
Yeah, it was mentioned once by this linguist.
Yeah.
Professor Pietentini, your approach is completely different. You are just a historian of a limited area of which you know so much. And so, of course, with all the reading you did, I mean, you came across Ibadism quite often, I'm sure.
Well, when I studied in Rome, Islamic studies, Ibadism was part of my academic background. Gabriele, Nalino, Levi della Veda, it was basic. So we had either we knew it, either we studied it, or stop, we had finished. And the French school as well. We were used also to hear and to listen conferences by Leviskis. And this is how I started to get acquainted with Ibadism and Ibadi doctrines. Then my route took a different way. I became a historian. I chose for history. And when I was parachuted to the island of Hormuz in 1972 to study Hormuz Island, I don't know, I didn't even know where it was. Then I came across an Ibadi community on the island of Hormuz and on the next island of Kashmir, not Kais but Kashmir. And I said, well, here it is. And when I came back and I was requested to write my book because of the Libera Docenza we still had in Italy, and that was on Hormuz, the Mulk and the Bandar and Mulk of Hormuz. Then I began to say, but Kashmir, and going through the Arabic sources, I came across Mas'udi, and there I found the first mention of Ibadism on this island of Kashmir since very early periods. Not Kishma, not misunderstood, and some colleagues of mine have done, and I have heard last year in Paris, Kishma, that is Kais. No. It was Kashmir, and the community is still there, and Ibadi communities are still very well alive all along the southern coast of Iran, around Bandar Lenge, that was the old Khung, Gambrun, that is Bandar Abbas today. Don't think up to Minab, just in that hinterland behind Bandar Abbas, Bandar Khamire, Bandar Lenge. After Khomeini's revolution, 72 was before, all the mosques changed the feature and became strictly Sunni, not Shiite, Sunni. And that was the main feature. So that is how my approach to Ibadism began a historical reality. So not so much the doctrine, but also the doctrine, but what kind of social, political force it represented through history, and especially, since I was coping with the Kingdom of Hormuz, within the Kingdom of Hormuz, both the Iranian side and Arabian side. And then I came across a lot of information of presence as a mercantile presence, which played a great role within a very tolerant cosmopolitan atmosphere as it was since the 10th century up to the 15th century. To the point, and I found very interesting what has been said this morning, Dar al-Aman. Dar al-Aman is a reality. It was Abd al-Razak Samarkandi, 1440, when he came to Hormuz heading a deputation to China, and he provides us with a very nice description of the kingdom and the city of Hormuz on the island. And he concludes that is why it is called Dar al-Aman. Then, okay, it is. And going through Italian archives, those nice Italian republics or city-states, I prefer the word city-states because then we come across Milan, dukedom, so it's not so much, don't tell to the Milan that it is a republic, it was a dukedom. Especially in the archives of Milan, there is a lively correspondence between the Duke and his agents, Cyprus, Alexandria of Egypt, and eastward, Damascus as well, where this kingdom, or I quote in Italian, or the Italian of the time, Signor de Amana, Sir of Amana, and this term Amana is always recurring. We are 1475. So it complements perfectly well what Samarkandi had to write. Moreover, we have also the cartography of the time, 15th century, before the Portuguese arrived, in which this land of the Señor de Amana or Amana is clearly marked on both sides, included Oman, present-day Oman, up to include some of the northern territories, including what is today Ras Al Khaimah. I prefer to speak in clearly what is the political situation of today, and it was the political situation of the time. So Julfer, and then going back to the chronicles of the time, appears to be its population for the majority Ibadi. Then we have Bahla, Niswa, Rustak and Rasatik, both. Wilkinson knows better than me. I've copied him. I've taken inspiration from his excellent studies. He's another father, but I can't say so because I am then a mother. Not his mother, a mother. And yes, it comes down to Kalhat, not northern than Julfar, but the role that this sheikdoms, or however we wish to call them, is really fundamental to the growth of Ibadism within the region and to the spread of Ibadism outside, up to Hind, Sindh, where I found mention of it, more than one source, and still there are Makran as well, that was included within the Kingdom of Hormuz. That historical point of view, I come to what you have said, a model, a pattern, a social force, which played a political role, but not an aggressive, neither a subversive. So the doctrine is a constructive doctrine, not a subversive doctrine. And it is interesting what in that document mentioned this morning, Portuguese of the 1550, I think, still it is mentioned Amana, when Hormuz was already on the wane, and the Yaruba were rising. So it is a sort of legacy that is going on.
May I just ask one question? The Abdurrazak Samarkandi, whom you mentioned, is this the author of the Matla As-Sa'dain?
The same person.
The Timurid period.
Yes, Timurid period. The title is in Arabic. Yeah. The Matla is written in Persian. Yes. And he was an official, very debated his life. But he was, he ended up inquisited for corruption by some Christian, the Christian of Trebizond, the ruler of Trebizond, but he was in charge of the diplomatic affairs of the Timurid court, and he was dispatched more than once to China. So he used to go down to Hormuz, already of terra firma, from there sail to China. Yes, it is the same one.
I didn't know that.
Professor Wilkinson, I took you as last person, but
not the least,
but the most Ibadit among us.
Well, it's very difficult to know where even to start. One thing I think one should correct, there's a great deal of emphasis now put on tolerance and mutual understanding. They could be pretty aggressive when they want to be. And the whole establishment of the imamate in southern Arabia was a very question. They were known as the Sharat, and they were much, much feared. And what you're dealing with is establishment based on the ideology of the true Islamic community. And that has survived in Oman off and on different times at different levels of statehood, or asserting themselves at the statehood level. And you still, one of the things I've tried to bring out is that even whatever time dynasty was there, they still appointed qadis and walis, and these were administrators, and these would form part of what you might say the khas is a very distinct division in Ibadism between the khas and the am. I mean, at one level, what you say, it means I'm a good Muslim. It's a very straightforward, there's nothing, never mind about the vision of God or what all that. You look at all this in an evolutionary way, but what it simply means to be a good Muslim. There's nothing in it that any other good Muslim can sort of object to the way that the everyday person behaves himself. It just happens to be that it's a Maoris who are, and of course in the Muzab, and you get the same thing there with Aprašas, not Aprašas, which is more,
the one before?
Yes. But I mean,
after.
insisting on the proper behaviour of the community, and when they have to go and migrate to the Tal, where it is that they're looked after, that they behave properly, and they keep their modest way of life. So you've got one level, what's it mean to be an Ibadah? It just means I'm a good Muslim. That what you have at the other level is this assertion of the right against there's a tolerance to a point. And as I say, it can become very aggressive. Taqiyya is one of the principles of Ibadism, and you dissimulate up to a certain point. There are other times when you have to establish your rights. And this is what they did. That's why you get a revival of this ideology when they feel they're being oppressed, when they feel they're being denied. That becomes an anti-colonial movement, and it asserts what you might today call a strong sense of Omani nationalism. Mm-hmm. But that Ibadi community, you see, the problem about Oman today is people say, oh, there's X% of Sunnis and there's Y% of Shia and there's Z% of Ibadis. So the Ibadis almost look like a minority. But if you look at this as a geographical basis, the core of the country is Ibadi. And this is the part, and this is the part where the society is deeply rooted in its country, in its history, and it knows who you are. You may be called something now, but I mean, we know that you come from that family, which itself came from that family, it intermarries with this family, and it goes back in this linkages. There's a very, very strong sense of Ibadi identity. But at the same time, you can find it in small communities which try to defend its values and has survived. And one of the most interesting things to me is to compare the nature of Ibadism in Zav, in Fusa, in Jerba, and Oman, and indeed when it goes into colonial situation in Zanzibar and East Africa. So, I mean, I think one way, obviously, there is an evolutionary approach to where it all started from, how it developed, how its theology developed, and it's the kind of thing which is the expert at, and I've been having a go at it too, and I've tried to reconstruct the standard model of the origins of Ibadism and put into place a new model. Whether you accept it or not, I don't know. We shall see. It's sort of my latest book. I'm waiting to get the reviews. In fact, to shudder at the idea of what I'm going to be lambasted with. But never mind, I've had my share. And you can't, the other thing is you cannot distinguish it from tribalism. Mm-hmm. It's in a tribal media. It rejected central government authority of the Umayyad King. Yeah. And it was based in that rejection. And who it took I mean, you know, who took the ideology and how it developed and then why it was in Basra and so on is a big and complex story, which is not here for discussing. But in the end, it implanted itself, as I say, in important areas in North Africa, but failed to survive. Why did it not survive in Africa? Why did it survive in Oman, etc., etc.? Is another issue. This is all tied up, I believe, partly with this geography. But having said that, what you have got is that it still today is associated with a strong sense of what I would call true Omani identity. And I've got to be careful what I say here, because of course there are certain periphery areas which consider themselves to be Omani where you don't have Ibadis. But that becomes a politically sensitive issue, of which perhaps we shouldn't talk about too much here.
No, well, I agree with what you say, but I mean, having a historical approach, dropping down the doctrine and all the doctrinal aspects, as a political and social and mercantile force, as it was in given period, it had to be aggressive. It had to defend its own interests. It was aggressive. Of course. And it's part of the history, but here and there, not only in Oman, of course, when the tribes from the hinterland came and with the collapse of the Rasulid system and reign, I mean, there was a shift of tribes from the Rasulid area eastwards. They were lured, these tribes, from the riches that they could find all along the coastal area and coastal region, because then we can go inland as well, never disconnect the sea from the hinterland. They defended themselves and they fought. Absolutely fought.
Yes, I mean other characters.
I do not disagree, but this is history.
Of course it is, and the point is that every Ibadi community has been a trading community. It's never lived in isolation. Yes. It's had to trade, it's had to migrate, and therefore you get this. This is where the tolerance comes in, because you have to strike a balance between your purity and the realities overseas, expansion or whatever it is. But the point is, you can examine this at any given moment in history, and you can also look at an evolutionary process. So you look at any one particular moment. Sometimes we have a lot of documentation, sometimes there's no documentation at all, and one of the missing periods is the Nabahina period in Oman, but never did Ibadism die away during that period. And many of the early Nabahina were in fact jolly good Ibadis, and they defended the Ibadi state. This is not politically correct in the Ibadism. They like to maintain with the Nabahina it all went wrong, but in fact, if you look at the history of the early Nabahina and the way it defended the state against both Mahmud al-Khalhati on one side and the invasions from Iran on the other, you see that they did a very good job of trying to defend Oman.
We have been touching a rather delicate subject, namely tolerance, which is a term propagated everywhere nowadays in the Western world. I have no doubt that tolerance does not exclude aggressivity at all. Exactly. It only depends on the situation. And you talked about internal tolerance inside the Ibadi community. And of course, the moment you get tribal tensions, then I think the tolerance is gone. bellicosity, I do not know whether this is in English, comes in. If we look to external tolerance, we come to this concept of, in the conference it was called maritime state. We could also say sea empire. And empire, of course, means aggressivity in a way. Sea means trade. So the question is, are trade and power or aggressivity necessarily combined? I think this combination was true, for instance, for Great Britain, where the empire was created with force. I wonder whether this is also true for the early Omani trade, maritime state. If you look at the boats which we saw in Tom Wadsworth's paper, in a way I have difficulties to believe it, because these are small boats, no cannons. You would not be able to establish a cannon there. They wouldn't be able to attack other people. They were simply there for trade.
No. They could become a very, very powerful fleet, very effective. They took the Dutch and the Dutch more than once on the cliffs, and the Dutch had terrible shipwrecks. Oh, yes. I am thinking to the poor Mongols on those boats having terrible problems when they attacked from Hormuz, the island of Kais, or they were sent and dispatched here and there. Very brave, the Mongols.
The first ascent of
the Mongols, of course,
they were archers. They needed the archers, and so they put the Mongols used to say, by boat, on those boats.
But Vosma is antiquarian. So he didn't show you the 80 gunboats the Omans had too in the 19th century.
The 19th, yes, I'm talking about the medieval empire. And my question would be, in the end, are the Portuguese the people who introduced the aggressivity into the sea trade?
No.
Do you think this existed before?
Think so.
We have all the records are about attacking Chinese junks. I've got lots of stuff about this. I mean, the first step, you'd had a sort of unified trade system under the Sassanids. That collapsed with the changes.
Yes.
And if you look at by the beginning of the 2nd century in Oman, what you find, you've got Bawari, they call Bawaris, they're pirates, raiding all over the place. And the first thing that you have to do is to deal with the Bawaris, extirpate these layers of the pirates and Socotra from right the way through to Aden and so on. Sure, they established themselves in these key points at the same time, and from this the point was, by the warfare of the time, the Omanis were the only people really had in some certain periods, the only people with a fleet.
So you say that the moment you have trade, you also have robbery and piracy, which makes sense in a way.
I forgot the term. It was Gisto who used it. He said, what was this, mercantile? He had a better translation of piracy. Mercantile something.
Competition. It's called protection costs often.
Yeah, okay, but no, he used it even more elegant word. Mercantile something, I don't know, I forgot it. Yeah, so, but it's simply, even in the pre-19th century period, the Omanis were able in getting out the Portuguese.
And anyhow, the Portuguese actually, the Yarra take over
Yeah.
The Portuguese fleet, in fact, and it's full of what they call renegados.
Mm.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but even in the early period, the fact is that the Omanis were able to establish themselves in various posts, and by establishing the authority on the coast, and by balance and mutual arrangements, these Oman agreements and allowing reciprocal trade. I mean, the early Omani fiqh, maritime fiqh, is full of arrangements about double taxation, what happens if you go down to East Africa, what happens, do you pay your zakat if you're in Aden, and all this double taxation, and when foreigners are taxed. And so the great deal of it is to maintain this continued, if you like, tradition of the Hind, of the maritime world. And it's not an aggressive thing. It may be an aggression at times, but on the whole, it is striking a balance of which Oman is playing a key part, but not the only part, in that maritime world. And therefore, it has to come to terms with the others as well.
Yeah, you see, I am simply hypothesizing and I try to play the devil's advocate. And what I wanted to say, or what I was trying to do, was to find the culprit for aggressivity in modernity, or in the West since the, let's say, 15th, 16th century. So I'm dreaming of a peaceful Oriental world before that, and then you get these people coming from outside. But I think that's
defending your beliefs is the essential feature.
Yeah.
Sometimes you defend those beliefs, and you actually have to go and. I mean, one of the first big debates, of course, is what is the nature of warfare with other Muslim communities. Yeah. And here we have fundamental principles.
Yes.
Which
we have books about that. Yes, and they do not talk about jihad because this was impossible. You don't have jihad among Muslims. No. They called it harb. This was said in one of the papers. Or muharaba. There is this very early kitab al-muharaba in Ibadi literature. I think this is beginning of the 3rd century Hijrah. And there it's explained how you deal with your enemies. And all the enemies are Muslims and not other people. Of course, there were no other people around at that time.
Oh yes, there were. There was also down East Africa. There were.
Of course,
it's you had these Oman agreements which allowed you to trade there peacefully, or for the Chinese to trade. But there are other times when the Tang dynasty begins to collapse. Before the famous fall of Canton, I've also got documents, material, dealing with, if you're off the Indian coast and you come across some Chinese junks, are you allowed to attack them? Yes.
Of course, yes. Yes, and I have the feeling that all those black people down there in East Africa were not amused when the Ibadi, they liked to do trade with them, but perhaps, they would have preferred to live by themselves.
Yeah, but they lived better with the Omanis.
Is this true?
Of course.
I
mean,
they had, and this is not
they
only
carried goods. They were the middlemen. I mean, you had in Princeton there were three zones. The direct control along the coast by the Omanis, then a kind of middle zone.
Yeah.
And there we have good documents. I mean, Aprašas's book, he has really good. And Richard Burton, he describes these roads where they had to pay, how they could get around, and so on and so on. Hongo. Yeah.
Can I have a short comment? What's interesting and important, I think, about this discussion is it does facilitate the integration of Ibadi communities into kind of daily practice of history and into global history. In a way, if we keep saying tolerance, it doesn't explain anything, it doesn't mean anything, right? And as you said, that was repeated a lot, but we don't even know what this means or what factors it plays in. In a way, I listen to all of this, like anybody can study the Ibadis as part of human history without feeling intimidated because they're different. Of course, you need to know in what sense they're different, doctrinal differences or theological differences, whatever, but it's the daily practice. It's what necessitates their behavior this way or that way, what applies to everybody else. And I think de-emphasizing theological aspects, because is very important, otherwise it becomes a very dangerous exercise.
Well, it's like all religions. I
Yeah.
mean, the Pope spent all this time saying peace, peace, peace. But at various other times there was rather less of that. I mean, let's be careful what I say.
You are right, but in my viewpoint, it is something that goes beyond it. It is a doctrine that has created a community, and the community has I'm again speaking as a historian, has inside a well-defined and specific pattern and model of governance. I use on purpose this modern word, which spread outside, and it is worldwide distributed. We don't find it only here, there, in power. We find it from Mashrek to Maghreb, through the seas and through the deserts. It is a mobile, let us say, doctrine, community, which in given period of the long history, because now we are talking about 14th century, because 14th century, it just come out at the start of Islam, it organizes itself even as a political, social and mercantile force. And it still is. It is not disappeared. It has played a role, a very well-defined role through 14th centuries in various and different parts of our world. And if we like, we can include Sicily. Why not? We had Arab dominion, Muslim dominion in Sicily for 2 centuries. And still we have enclaves in Sicily speaking a very a nice dialect, Arabic dialect or Berber dialect. If you go to Agrigento, it is only Berber. And there are still, I mean, I have a colleague of mine who is working on this issue. They are previously Ibadi communities. Because of trade, likely, and she has traced back the origin, where they're coming from, Africa, of course, why they settled in Sicily, and what they were doing within the Sicilian context and outside. So this is very interesting, and I think that in my viewpoint, this is something that for me is very interesting. This worldwide dimension as a doctrine, as a social force, as a political force, as a mercantile and cultural force.
And this captures actually, as you said at the beginning, in terms of the mobility, this captures what I'm finding in my studies on the 20th century. And these development, these changes are just part of this mobility, yes, which really captures the whole phenomenon.
There is one feature, I think, which is important to understand in the evolution of Ibadism. There's always been a dialectic between Qu'ud and Shira. That is the seated, the peace, and those who go out and sell their lives. The activation, if you like, Qawl or Amal. You get the same thing in the nature of imams, Difa'i imams,
yes,
and Shira imams.
Yeah.
It's much more complicated. In fact, all the early imams, in fact, were Da'if imams, Difa'i imams, or they were doing Shira. But this is I don't want to get in complication how these terms are. But the point is, it always had to strike a balance between these two aspects of Ibadism, which, therefore, at different times, through taqiyya, through pragmatism, through whatever it is, sometimes it activates, and other times it remains relatively quiet. Yes, it's just, I think that one should understand that there are these two aspects that are incorporated in the whole the dogma of Ibadism too. They're always discussing this. What conditions are you allowed to go and expand, and how you do it? Yeah,
The flexibility of the doctrine.
Yeah.
I mean, not extreme, flexible, adapting to various political and also geographical context. Because, I mean, if you go from Maghreb to the Indus Delta, you are confronted with a geographical and cultural context very differing between themselves. Indus Mouth, you have all the Hindi civilization, Central Asia cultures, the Turkish, how they adapted themselves with the Turks.
Yeah.
I was really surprised with the Mongols, and later on with the Portuguese.
How they
And
adapt
all what
themselves
came
in
afterwards.
Tabora with the blacks.
Yes, the Buid that are Dailami, they are not Persian. They are Dailami, autochthonous population from the Caspian Sea.
Yeah.
So it is the flexibility, and in a way, when I was talking about, how you say, not aggressive, I meant the balanced, the capability of balance,
That's right.
of balancing inside themselves and with the outside world.
I think that's a good final remark. And let's hope maybe we can continue in Muscat.
Yes, why not?
If you decide.
Yeah.
In the Red Mosque, wearing the baya, sweating.
Well, the smell of Bakhur will really make the ambiance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Galba. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.